Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength BodCast. Hey guys, today I am talking with Ian Adamson. Ian is a former adventure racer. In fact, at one time he was said to be the world's toughest man. He has over 10 world championships from adventure racing, but he's also a producer, a forensic scientist, and an entrepreneur. And at the end of the interview, Ian gives his secret to overcoming any obstacle that stands in your way. Anyway, guys, this is a fascinating man with a lot to say. Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength Podcast. So, Ian, I really don't even know where to start with you. You've done more in your lifetime than I think it would take me at least 10 or more lifetimes to accomplish. You're a world champion adventure racer. You've got what, 10 world championships?
11, I think.
Oh my gosh.
Not quite sure. I've got, in actual chance, I think it's something like 11, somewhere around there.
But you've competed all over the world, and you've been in every grueling situation probably imaginable for anyone. What got you into this? How did you get started with adventure racing?
It was a process of elimination. So I got the Olympic bug quite young. Not sure why. I think back in the, I hate to say it, the 60s and 70s, when you saw the Olympics, it was kind of the big thing. And this was the case probably because of the broadcast system. When I was growing up, there were 3 TV channels where I lived. And then obviously that's changed a bit now, but TV isn't really a thing anymore. But back in the day, you had limited options. And then as a young person growing up in Australia, Australians are pretty passionate about sport. And maybe it's because they're at the other end of the world and remote from everything, but have deep roots throughout Britain and these days Asia. And close links to the US. So Australians always followed sport, and I was one of those. But tried a lot of stuff. My grandfather was in soccer or football, as most people call it. He was the president of the Australian Soccer Football Federation. He had been a soccer international for Scotland. And so I kind of grew up around it, but didn't really know much about it. I just knew he did it. And I had no idea what it meant, except he would have stories about marathoners and cyclists and other sporting people. So it was sort of always there somewhere in the background. Consequently, of course, I played soccer from a very young age, I think about 6 till 18. So I took it to a reasonably competent level in Australia, including coaching and reffing. But that always overlapped with other stuff because I was outside all the time. I was a typical kid making forts and trees and running around in the forest and playing in the tidal mud flats of Sydney Harbour, all this kind of stuff. And that was, I guess, as a young person, that's adventuring. I do sort of dumb, crazy stuff too. Our next door neighbors had a little sailing dinghy called a sabot, S-A-B-O-T. I think it's Dutch. Tiny little thing, 8 feet long. Just tiny, tiny little boat. So as a tiny, tiny little person, I would take this tiny little boat and I would sail, for me, pretty long distance out across Sydney Harbour, about 16 miles, I think it was, out through the harbour out into the ocean. At 8 years old, I'd be kind of tinkering around in this little shell of a boat.
At 8?
Yeah, pretty young. My parents they just roll their eyes and say, hey, just call us if you need help, which I did fairly frequently. So I'd end up at some random beach somewhere and, hey, Mom, can you come and get me? I wasn't, it also led to other things. I'd break boats. I got run over by a yacht at one point with a friend of mine and smashed the boat up into another boat into lots of bits and got picked up. Didn't tell my mom, just said, hey, come and pick me up. She didn't realize that it was me and my friend in lots of bits of boat, not just the boat. So that was kind of my habit. I was never really afraid to go out. They were pretty encouraging. My folks were part of this. They were, do whatever you want. I think at age 10, it was, when you turn 10, you can do whatever you want. You can go wherever you want. Just let us know. Literally. Obviously, this day and age, that doesn't really happen much.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for my parents to tell me that now.
Yeah. But back in the early to mid 70s, that was it's sort of an acceptable thing. Just go and do it. My parents traveled a lot. They were academics. So they did, research scientists. My dad was a field geologist, amongst other things, and he traveled everywhere. I mean, he had work in Africa and Antarctica, and he was away for 6 months at a shop. So we were no strangers to the idea of the world being a pretty big place. I think when I was between 11th and 12th grades, I took a few months off and traveled in Europe. Same kind of deal. Some folks said, yeah, here's a number in Paris if you get stuck in France. Here's one in Britain. Don't call unless there's good news. No news is good news, basically, right. Is what it was. So no, didn't call back. Never had to. Went back to high school, finished that, then took another year out. I was trying to walk across Asia to Europe, actually. Didn't happen. I got started in Hong Kong, went to Macau, through Tibet, back up towards Mongolia. That was 1986, so the Chernobyl was doing its thing, and they closed the border. I had my visa and my ticket and everything. So I was trying to get across Russia to Stalingrad at the time. That didn't happen. So I ended up going down through Pakistan, tried to get over to Afghanistan. So I walked up to the Khyber Pass, which is one of these high passes. That was a bad idea. There was a war going on. So hightailed it out of Pakistan, got quite sick actually, got airlifted on a Pan Am flight in first class to Frankfurt, of all places. I was really keen to walk across Iran or somewhere and get over to Europe that way, but that didn't happen because I was too sick. I have a picture of me in May 1986, full head of hair. And then in June 1986, no hair. And it stayed away since then. I don't know what the illness was, but it was not good.
Oh, man. So what got in your mind where you decided I'm going to walk across Asia and go? What causes that?
I was adopted at 2 weeks old, and my biological mother was from England. Her parents were from somewhere in the Middle East. My maternal grandmother, Jewish, from the Middle East somewhere, and my maternal grandfather, British, the Royal Air Force captain, pilot, apparently. On my father's side, my father was a physician in Australia, but from Singapore, and his parents were from China. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was an air traffic controller at the Singapore airport, which at the time was the old British Air Force Base. So I had this kind of desire. I knew my grandparents on my father's side come from China, so I decided, hey, I'll go across China, go and figure out, see what it's all about. Back in '86, it was pretty. It was very green, meaning that everyone wore green uniforms, like Mao uniforms, green or gray. So that was pretty much what was going on in China at the time. You could visit a few places. You could go to, I think, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, maybe a couple other places, but you had to have very strict travel requirements. Being a young, crazy person, I completely ignored it. Actually hid in the back of a mail truck. I'd hitchhike on trains by just waiting until the train stopped and then jump in the back somewhere. And then just wind up in some random place in China, having no idea where it was. Then I'd jump out. And of course, at this point, doing that, you end up in places where you're not supposed to be. And I looked Chinese enough that people wouldn't really question me. They just thought I was dumb, but they were probably right. And then at one point, decided to go into Tibet. So jumped in the back of a mail truck, hid under the mail bags, and found my way across into Tibet. Not legal at the time. I think you could take tours, but this was definitely not tours. This was walking and hitching one of the two roads. There's a north and a south road in from Chengdu. So I think we took I don't remember which road, but it was pretty interesting. Had a really interesting experience. There was a guy, I was in a village, swarmed with Chinese people. At the time, they were quite short, and I'm not a tall guy. I'm only 5'8". But back in the day, I guess it was a nutritional thing, is that they were fairly short. So they would be at my kind of shoulder height, so I'd have a head above them. I was walking to a village and I saw this huge crowd of people, and then a tall, European guy. And I was saying, oh my gosh, there's a European guy over there. So we walked towards each other. It was a Canadian, it turned out, studying Chinese. And he had the same experience. He said, this is really weird. I saw this huge crowd of people and some guy with his head over their shoulders, and it was me. So we ended up chatting for a while. And then one thing led to another. And I actually ran into some adventure racing people that I came to know later. The Cranes, Adrian Crane and his brother, they were cycling. They were cycling across from Kashgar, which is far western China, or Kashi. And they were cycling into Tibet. I was walking across. We just kind of ran into each other and they said, hey, you should check this place out. So when they closed the border into Russia, I hopped a train and went over to Kashgar. And that's how I ended up going into Pakistan, because they just opened oh gosh, it's the world's highest road. Basically, the road from China into Pakistan, the road is some ridiculously high. It's like 15,000 feet or something.
Oh man.
So I made it to the border. There's a big no man's land in basically high desert. I was kind of standing there scratching my head like, what am I going to do now? Because there was no way to get over to, I mean, there was a guy with a rifle just kind of scratching his head going, you're an idiot. What are you doing here? But then a National Geographic team in a Land Cruiser, old school Land Cruiser, or Range Rover. It's a Range Rover. He was the French guy and his camera crew, and he was making the first crossing in over 100 years into China. And he said, oh, no one's ever crossed from China into Pakistan. So I said, hey, can I just jump in with the driver who was from Pakistan? He said, sure, yeah, go ahead. So I jumped in with the driver and he drove me to a place called Gilgit. So apparently, as far as I know, it was the first crossing from China to Pakistan back when they opened it up in 1986, May 1986.
So you're like the real life Forrest Gump.
Yeah, so I don't run as well.
I don't know. It's funny because you've been called the Yoda of adventure racing. And I even read where you were named the toughest man on the planet. How many races have you done? Do you know?
Oh gosh, no, I actually have no idea. You could do a thumbnail it, I suppose. That's an interesting question because I really started racing, typical high school track and field and swimming and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't count, I suppose, because that's just high school.
That was a warm
After
up.
high school, it's kind of warm up, which was everything for me. You asked the question how to get into adventure racing. I guess this is the answer: is that I was never actually particularly good at any one thing. Good enough. I mean, I could get to national level, sometimes international level in something. But the more sports you add, so if you go from like running to duathlon, then now you're two sports to get a little bit better than just running or just swimming. And then you add a third, you add cycling. My father was quite a good cyclist, so I actually road cycled, competed as an age group at national level. So I had cycling competency. And just adding sports means that less and less people can do it. That's all it is. It's not that you get any better. I don't think I'm any better than anyone else. I just have more stuff.
I don't know. You've got some interesting traits about you.
Yeah. So that was the number of races. Gosh, I would race from college all the way through to when I until I retired. So that would be from about 1984 to 2007. So that's like 24 years of competition every weekend, maybe at some times like 2 or 3 times a weekend and during the week. So I'd do like cycling time trials or swim meets or something, canoe races, and that would be normal. In college, I would have been almost every day there was a competition of something: triathlon, swimming, cycling, canoeing, kayaking, on and on and on. Surf lifesaving. I just like to compete, orienteering. So it would be, I think probably through until I left employment as an office jockey, 5 times a week. Wow. I was competing in something. And then as a professional, it completely changed from racing all the time, which was just for pleasure really, to, now I've got to eat. And then it went to, okay, now I've really got to drill down on it. And then it was a lot less racing. So probably once a week with a competition, and then once a month for something that paid the bills. So that was for about 12, 13 years. So you do the math. That's a lot of racing.
More races than I have fingers and toes, by, again, those 10 lifetimes. But you're also, before I get into this next question, what was your longest race? How many days?
11. Yeah, 11. The longest one I think there was a couple about that length. The one that really sticks out is the Elf Authentic Adventure. Elf was actually the French petroleum company, but they were sponsoring a thing called the Authentic Aventure, which was created by Gérard Fouzy, who also created the Regoise, which was the first internationally known expedition race in adventure racing in 1989. He sold that, I guess, and left, and then he started a thing called the Elf, did a few of those. So we did one in the Philippines. Fantastic race. Wow, it was brutal though. 11 days. Every day we'd do basically 100 kilometers, so 60 miles a day. And they were basically 100-kilometer legs. We would paddle native boats between the islands. We'd go on foot. And then we would actually it was off-road inline skating of all crazy things.
What?
Yeah, off-road inline skating, these giant wheels, big inflatable wheels.
Oh my goodness.
And the hiking in the jungle it was brutal. The orienteering, the navigation was absolutely ferociously difficult because the jungles are so thick. There was a kind of a separatist insurrection at the time. We had leaflets at the opening ceremonies. We had leaflets with crossed AK-47 and things saying "You are not safe." So the
How did that make you feel? Did it make you feel safe?
It was exciting. And we ran across all sorts of military during the race. And I mean, both sides, they didn't care about that. They didn't give a hoot about what we were doing. They didn't care. They cared about each other. So they were actually super friendly, no matter who it was we ran into, which was every now and again, crazy jungle. We were on an island called Leyte, I think it is. It was where the US it was one of the giant World War II battles with the Japanese. Like the fleets were battling these gigantic Japanese battleships, the last battleships really that ever existed, because they didn't do so well after the US Air Force bombed the hell out of them. But they had a base, the US had a base there, and we actually ended up on the base. But we didn't really know it. We saw this thing on the maps, and we couldn't really find it. We were just walking around. And then it finally dawned on us as we started to look around us that the shapes of the jungle were the shapes of things like tanks and planes, and the jungle had overtaken it and just completely overwhelmed this Air Force base with hangars, and kind of rummaged around in the vines. You could find stuff. I mean, seriously, like full on stuff just sitting there. It was really crazy.
That's cool. So longest race was 11 days. How much suffering is involved in
enough.
an adventure race? Enough?
Enough to make it worthwhile.
Okay, because that's what I was wondering. Like, how do you gear yourself to endure all that you have to physically put yourself through? And it's not just physical, because it's got to be mental, just such a mental burden, or just.
Well, that's a good question. The first long multi-sport kind of races people do, they find them quite difficult. I had the same experience. My first race was kind of a beer bet. It was car crash curiosity. I was watching this. My friends were doing it, and I was supporting as a logistics group. And I was watching what they were doing, and they were Olympians. I mean, these guys and girls were fantastic athletes. And I thought, not a chance I'll ever do that. Looks way too hard and looks really painful. But over a beer, there's usually this kind of, hey, at least I'll try one just to see what they're doing. Make me a bit of support crew. Well, I did try one, and boy, did it hurt. Holy crap, it was so hard. It was only a 2-day race. This thing called the Wild Trek, one of the early races that started in about 81 or 82. And at the end of the race, I was thinking, there is no way I will ever do that again. That is misery. But then someone put a beer in my hand, and I was, typical, had a beer and pizza, was feet up, chatting about the race, and then I'd already signed up for the next year within a few hours, just like that. So that's the start. But the first time out the gate, physically quite challenging, or beyond anything you've ever experienced, is usually how it goes. Over time, when you develop the physical capabilities or the athletic ability, then it becomes a sort of a mental game, and you're sort of tinkering with okay, how much can I push, and how much does it hurt, and then given some more experience, it becomes less mental and it starts to become a bit emotional. It actually becomes, I guess it's like, I've talked to a lot of special forces and say it's a lot like war. The experiences are so intense that you get addicted to it.
Huh.
It's a literal truth in my experience, and all my teammates I've talked to. It's an addiction, not an unhealthy one, I would imagine. Well, in some respects, but that's that's another story. And then once you kind of can manage all of that stuff, so you get very familiar and good at managing the physical, the mental, the emotional. Then there's this, and I hesitate to say this because I'm pretty skeptical about this stuff, but spiritual. It's a transcendent experience. And if you can ever get there, that's sort of the goal. That becomes the thing that you end up chasing. It's this crazy experience, which the only way I can explain it, it's spiritual, because it's definitely not emotional, physical, or mental. It's way beyond that. That takes an extraordinary amount of time and effort to develop. And if you can get to that level, then racing becomes kind of secondary to the end goal, but it makes it very easy. Well, I shouldn't really say that. It's never easy. And that can take decades. And keep in mind that my going into adventure racing, I already had 10 years of doing some pretty crazy stuff. And in that development as an adventure athlete, it was also things like, all right, I just walked 1,000 kilometers. That's can't be that hard.
How many times do you guess that you've reached that spiritual state that you were talking about getting to?
Oh, every race when I was a pro, I'd say. Yeah, every race. That was that was part of the addiction. The income didn't hurt, but the addiction was definitely there.
Have you been, since you retired, have you been able to reach that state or find that spot again, or in other ways?
I maybe a couple of times. Yeah, when I was after I quit, I didn't quit. I just retired. I'd had enough. I think when I retired, it was technically it was 2007, but my last race was 2006, and that was my 11th win at the AR World Champs, which was quite new at the time. And I figured it was also when Lance Armstrong had won 11 things, so I thought, hey, it's good enough. I feel like I could go on for a few years, but I think I'll quit now because there's nowhere to go but down. When you're on top of your game, there's nowhere to go but down. And we had good competition at the time. Fantastic teams were out there. Even some athletes who came back last year for the Eco Challenge were competing, and they sort of unretired themselves. And I said, no way, I'm not unretiring myself, not a chance. I'll watch them suffer and have fun. And I just lost your original question. There's a bit of a tangent.
Oh, no. So yeah, I was just wondering if you were able to ever reach that spiritual state.
Oh, yes.
Since your retirement.
Right. Yeah. So after retiring, I did a couple of things that I couldn't do or chose not to do when I was racing. The Badwater Ultra Run. Chris Kosterman had been asking if I could do it for years, and every year I'd say, yeah, it looks really cool, but it doesn't pay anything, and I need to win. I need the income, so I'll only do things that pay. And then after retirement, Charlie Engel, quite a good friend of mine, had unfortunately not been able to do it because of some convoluted and really astonishingly bad work by the US government on catching him for wire fraud when he was doing his documentary running across the Sahara. His loan officer had pushed a loan on him, and then he had signed papers while he was in Africa, and they grabbed him off the plane and said wire fraud. He was like the only guy in the entire US when the housing system collapsed that got nailed for something he didn't do. Was his loan officer. Anyway, so he couldn't do the run, and he had asked me to do it because he was going to do a documentary. So we were going to do the run for his documentary. He didn't do it, and I just said, oh, sure, I'll do it anyway. Sounds like fun. So did the Badwater, and it was really, really fun. It was a hot year, but it was so easy. Oh, that's not a very nice thing to say. On a relative basis, it was logistically a lot simpler running with a giant support crew than being self-contained for weeks with nothing. So of course, in that context, it's relatively easy. From a running perspective, it's really hard because it's like 19,000 feet of elevation gain across 3 mountain ranges from, it's a crazy race. So yeah, in doing that, yeah, for sure. And it's about 30 hours or 28 hours or something for me.
With all the adventure races you've done, you were with teammates. Do you find that it has made you understand people better, or made you a better people person, or like there's got to be some kind of like psychological advantage to working with people through such harsh conditions for and coming together to achieve a goal.
Yeah, it does. It exposes, it amplifies people's proclivities, their nature. So we'd see all sorts of, it reveals people's core really fast. Um, some people can hide stuff for a while, but never for good. It just comes out eventually. So over our careers, we pretty much had a squad, and it was a big kind of free flowing dynamic thing. We raced in the US as a limited liability corporation. We called it Elite Adventure Team, and there were three owners. It was me, Mike Close, and Mike Tobin. Those guys have won multiple world championships in sports, solo sports, so they're capable athletes. We ran this thing as a squad, so we'd have, people didn't really know this, but we'd have 2 or 3 teams in any given race. And it was rare that we didn't get first, second, and third, or first, second, or third, or something like this. We just different names with various different named teams with various people coming in and out. A lot of Kiwis, a lot of Aussies. We would have, it could be something like, we started as Eco Internet and then Reeboks. We have various names: Reebok, Salmon, Nike for a really long time, Nike ACG, Nike Beaver Creek, Vale. We had all these different names that we'd race under with various combinations of people. And the squad, for the most part, stuck together. It had its early genesis from Kiwis. Actually, there was this Tasman competition between Kiwis and Aussies in the 80s. And we'd race against each other. And then ultimately in the international scene, we sort of came together. And by the 90s, it was all the same people who used to compete. And then because it went from sort of solo or pair racing to team racing in the true sense, like 3 or 4 people together. So we all came together, and over the probably 20 years, that squad morphed and changed and became many things, including the athletes today. In fact, a couple of them, quite a few of them, and sometimes their kids now did quite well the Eco Challenge. Well, actually all in the top like 5. Wow. First, second, third, fourth, fifth kind of thing. So they're all there somewhere. This early genesis. It's really interesting. There's only really one person I didn't race with. Well, actually, that's not quite true. For the most part, I did not race with Nathan Favre. We raced against him a lot over the years. And in one race in the Primal Quest in 2005, I'm going to say 4 or 5, it was a unfortunate fatality in that race, but we actually joined with their team. I think it was Seagate at the time. I think they're still Seagate and Nike. And we actually got in each other's boats. So I raced with Christina in her boat, and then Michael raced with, so I think Nathan raced with Danelle, and we just kind of jumped it when we formed one big team to go to the finish. So that's the only time I actually raced with Nathan. The rest of the time we raced against each other. But almost everyone else in the teams, you'll see, kind of came in and out. Raced with Richard Usher in the World Champs in 2006. He went on to a very good career. He was an Olympian too. And then, Chris Vaughan raced with our team in the raid and won. That was his first big win. I think he's still racing. He was on the winning team in Eco Challenge last year with Nathan. So interesting group of people, almost overwhelmingly fantastic. Good friends with pretty much everyone from the 80s to this day.
That's awesome. So you're retired, but you're also working on projects. Like you're actually trying to get adventure racing into the Olympics. Is that right?
Obstacle sports would be more accurate.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So I met Joe DeSena, who started Spartan Race in, I'm going to say late 90s, early 2000s. He'd done the Eco Challenge. He had done very well on Wall Street and had basically a corporate incentive travel sort of program company-ish. Don't know exactly what it was. He wanted to put on an adventure race which included his clients, teams of clients. And it was Expedition BVI in 2001, right after 9/11. So it was a really interesting time. ended up, so I was tapped to help basically put on the course, build the course and direct the race with another colleague of ours, Don Mann, Navy SEAL. We put this thing on and it was super fun. I have a sailing background, so we rented 50-foot yachts for every team, and they would sail around, did some regatta starts, actually yacht racing, sail around the BVI, end up in really nice places, and they'd do fun adventures, mountain biking and diving and swimming and kayaking and sailing and all this kind of stuff. So that was part of what I had started doing early on, which was having an exit strategy. So understanding or having the perception that racing professionally was a very short career and the chances of doing it well was pretty minimal. I figured that going into it, after leaving full-time employment, I became a contractor as biomedical engineering, and then did that so that I could train enough to become a professional athlete. I successfully made the transition, and then thought, oh shit, excuse me, I'd better have an exit strategy because this isn't going to last very long. So within a few years, by 99, I was, so I went full-time adventure racing in 98. 99 started my exit strategy, which was to direct and produce events. So I started as a contractor to IMG in 99, and then started working on things like the Outdoor Quest, which at the time was the wealthiest adventure race, went for 8 TV seasons, lots and lots of money. Even by today's standards, like I think, well, yeah, huge amount, even by today's standards in absolute terms. So it was then directing races, and then started producing races, and then started working with the television producers and kind of made the slide. And by 2001 was pretty much had made the ability to exit real to be just an event and television producer. But but I didn't retire. I just kept going for another 10 years. So even though I'd made the strategy, so then I was having dual lives. I was doing event television production and racing, which was interesting because it gave me really good insight into why event and TV show competitions are the way they are, but also how to do them better. And also, so it actually played in well to being a professional, because as a professional is someone who truly makes a living and does it ethically and morally correctly. Doing that's hard. You can be the best athlete, doesn't make you a good professional. And you can be a spectacular professional even if you're not the best athlete. So I kind of walked the line right down the middle of pretty good and good enough.
Good enough. I like it. That is. Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
This is really fascinating to me. You are an expert witness in sports and recreation, specializing in zip lines, obstacle courses, obstacle races, and adventure sport events. In forensics, what does that mean?
Oh yeah, so I work for a company called Robson Forensic, and where it's a company of expert witnesses. Expert witnesses are people who have a very unusual background and understanding of something quite specific, typically. So a huge bank of knowledge and experience. And typically expert witnesses, good ones, are quite old, because it just takes that long to understand what's going on. And I'm relatively old. I guess if you say closer to 60 than 50, put it that way. As quite an old person, I've accumulated a very strange and unusual tool set, which includes understanding deep knowledge of adventure sports and aerial adventure courses. Another strange thing that I did partly because of events and climbing. I have a bit of a climbing background. My father and my brother, actually, my brother was a very good climber. That led to some of the things that we'd start putting in races, in TV show race competitions, including ropes courses, zip lines, and all these kind of weird things that subsequently have become actual things. And now the zip line parks. It used to be, it was a climbing thing, was to get between stuff. Tyrolean traverses. They became zip lines when you start to go fast. Then they became a kind of a thing in aerial adventure courses, originally for corporate training. Well, we were making these things, making very big, very fast ones. And we learned a lot doing this in races. We had one in China actually in 2000, I think. started on the top of a very, very high bridge over the Yangtze River up near the foothills of Tibet. And we had them go down this immense rope, slide down this immense rope with a little pulley into the river, sort of downstream, and then angle off into the side. But they were going so fast, they were melting the pulleys and started melting the rope.
Wow.
We started learning a lot with these things because no one was really doing these. No one that I know, I'd never even heard of them. We just kind of made them up. Like, hey, let's go off this 400-foot high bridge and 1,000 feet down the river and see what happens. If worst comes to worst, I'll fall in the water, which is what they did. So we were doing these things, and that became a lot more. Then I started going, oh shit, I better engineer this, because I was an engineer. So I started engineering them. Then a friend of mine, such a long story. Sorry about the length of it.
Okay.
My wife, for 20 some years, was a sideline reporter for the Professional Bull Riders Tour. Yeah.
Wow.
She went to school with a guy called Randy Bernard, who was the CEO. And I used to work every now and again on the shows as, something in the TV world. At one point, Randy said, "Oh, let's do an opening thing. They'd have opening stuff like, Blue Man Group or people doing tricks on motorbikes," and said, "Hey, let's do a zip line." So I went out to Vegas and built a zip line from the top of the Thomas and Mack Center down into the arena. And it was fast. I mean, you're dropping out of the sky basically. And the idea was to have the National Guard do it. So a friend of mine, Billy Madison, and I, Billy's an adventure racer, won the Naked Challenge in 98, foreman at the Vale Ski Patrol, owns a rafting company, good climber. I said, "Hey, Billy, come out. We're going to do this really fun zipline thing for the PBR World Finals in Las Vegas." And he said, "That sounds great." So out we went, we took our ropes and we built this thing, and we were testing it out, and we were like falling out of the ceiling and like screaming across the arena in clouds of dust. And the National Guard is standing there, and the guy saying, "Oh, we can't do that. That's way too dangerous." And so, "Hang on a minute, we haven't finished it yet." So it never actually happened. We did all the setup, but they didn't put it in the show. They said, "Oh, it's too dangerous. National Guard can't do that." I think, hang on a second, you're the National Guard. You're supposed to be saving us. Anyway, but Randy's uncle owns a winery up in Central Coast of California, Santa Margarita Ranch. He had just done a zip line in Costa Rica and was talking to Randy and said, "Hey, I really want to put zip lines on my winery." And Randy said, "Oh, I know a guy who does that," which I didn't, but he said, "Hey, Ian, you should talk to Carl." Happens to be right near where we live in California, in San Luis Obispo. So I met Carl and I went out, and I started looking at the topography, and we thought, "Oh, well, we'll put a zip line over here." So I basically looked at what was possible. He wanted something big. So we built a 1,500-foot zip line across the valley in the winery, basically in the along the San Andreas Fault, where it's really hilly. And the winery, so I engineered it, designed it, and then Carl and I went out with like a D9 bulldozer and a bunch of heavy equipment and built it. Engineered it though, like with big steel posts and all sort of stuff. And one thing led to another. And then today, I think it's the biggest zipline park maybe in the US. Because it's over now 12, 13 years, it's got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we built a really big one, half a mile long. And that's a big line. In case you didn't know, it's like 3,000 feet long. It's immense. And you get it going really fast. You can get 60 miles an hour if you really go at it. You probably get 65 miles an hour, which is quite fast. So they shut down zip lines in California because there was quite a few fatalities.
Oh.
We weren't shut down though. There was a weird thing. Carl ran into what's called a QZ inspector. It's basically people that examines amusement parks for the state of California. It just kind of ran into it, this guy who lived in San Luis, and he said, "Hey, we're doing this over here. I know they shut everything down. Maybe you can take a look." So this guy came over. Because we'd engineered it. I mean, we're talking gigantic, like 12-inch I-beams stuck in tons of concrete and massive cables. And I wasn't going to let anything happen to the structures. I thought, this is going to be bomb-proof. And it was. And he looked at it and went, "Oh, never seen a zip line like that before. Perhaps we need to," and they started writing standards. So one thing led to another. It was kind of the formation of the basis for approval of zip lines in California. They never shut us down because we were okay. Everyone else got shut down. So they were the last man standing. I was sitting in a standards meeting for obstacle course racing of all things, because we're doing international standards for obstacle events. And sitting next to me was a woman who said, wow, you've really got an interesting background. Would you be interested in doing expert witness work? And I said, what's that? She goes, yeah, you should call this number. So I called the number, and it was Robson Forensic people. And then one thing led to another, and then I came on board as an expert for zip lines. And then that became aerial adventure courses, and then that became other stuff, and this keeps getting more and more stuff. In fact, that was the call I was on earlier, was a practice group for some of that stuff, which is fascinating. And so what we do, this is a long, long story to tell you what expert witness is. In a legal case, let's say someone is on a zip line, let's say they're on a backyard zip line, and they get hurt. And they go, oh, that's no good. That was bad. I think I'm going to sue the owner of the house for the backline zip. It's typically not domestic or residential, but something like this. And then they scratch their heads and they go to a law firm. The law firm goes, oh, actually, we know nothing about zip lines. How on earth are we going to do this? And they go on the internet and they search and they find someone who knows about zip lines. And it has to be a very unusual skill set. And mine happens to be quite unusual. Mechanical engineer, sports medicine, event production, TV show production, and competition. And that set of skill sets or experience is quite useful for being an expert. So I would say, well, for sure, in that space, I'm an expert because I know quite a lot about stuff.
Yes, you do. That is awesome. With all of your accomplishments, the races you've done, the suffering you've put yourself through, all the championships, and then the business acumen that you have, what would you say what is a person's biggest obstacle to reaching success, or whatever that might be for them or their goals?
Stating a goal is a good start. You'll hear people say, oh, I could never do that. It's like, hey, we ever thought about doing the Ironman? And they go, oh, I could never do that. Well, I'm pretty sure they will fulfill that goal. So they just stated a goal. So I could never do that is a great goal. And it's an easy one to fulfill. You can do the opposite. And you see, I've seen it quite a lot. I've seen people who objectively may not satisfy criteria to have great success at something, but they're so determined that they do. They don't see a limitation. That's a good way to achieving things. And it always takes time. And people will say, oh, you had such a great success at adventure racing from the start. I said, well, no, not really. I mean, the start that you know is not the start that I know. The start that you know was 20 years after I started. So it's a kind of contextual thing. I mean, you'll see it with a lot of athletes as they go, oh, you must be so talented and genetically gifted. And for the most part, I don't think that's true. I think it's grit and determination.
Yes.
You see it a lot in a lot of sports, and I've seen it in great detail and up close. Grit counts for a huge amount. So, and that's life itself. Grit is how you get things done. You keep saying I've done so much stuff. Well, I suppose, but it takes about 10 years. If you really work at something, it takes about 10 years to optimize it. Malcolm Gladwell's book talks about it in terms of 10,000 hours. For most people, if you spend 4 hours a day, every day doing something, it's like 10 years will take you to get there. If you do a lot more, of course, it's a lot quicker. So you can halve that time. You could get really good at something, right? Truly world-class at something in 5 years if you just bury yourself.
Ian, thank you so much for being on. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing your story with me and giving me your time.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. Like they say, the older I get, the better I was, and I am definitely getting better.
Yes, you're on fire. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great weekend.